Awesome, awesome. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our media strategy in HIV criminalization, repeal, and/or reform efforts webinar being brought to you today by Positive Women's Network USA and the Sarah Project. This is part of the After HIV Is Not a Crime Training Academy 3 that we had in Indiana. This is the After series for folks that weren't able to attend or need a refresher. There's been a series of webinars for the breakout sessions that took place, along with there are plenaries that were live streamed that you can find on the Facebook page of HIV Is Not a Crime. So this webinar will be discussing the best media practices I know for advocates and activists that are out there doing the work to repeal or reform HIV criminalization laws in their states. So at the Training Academy, Kenyon Farrow and Jennie did a breakout session. And today, Jennie will be going over what was discussed at that session, and hopefully we'll have some great conversation and dialogue after she goes through her slides. Take it away, Jennie.
Cool, thank you, Kamaria. Yeah, so I think I know a lot of you over here. Glancing through your names, I think there are some of you that I don't know. So I will introduce myself for those who don't know me. My name is Jennie Smith-Camejo. I am the Communications Director for Positive Women's Network USA. I've been in this position for a little over 3 years. And it's really exciting. I've really gotten to watch a lot of the efforts to repeal and or modernize HIV criminalization laws in different states around the country. I was able to help out a little bit with California, and I'm now currently helping with Florida as well, which is really exciting. I was living in California when SB 239, I think that's the right number, was going. I wasn't there when it passed, but I was there during the work to get it even, to a bill form. And now I moved to Florida, so now I'm really excited to be helping with the Florida effort as well. And I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this. I probably should have already known, but I just found out while I was helping edit our monthly policy update that went out this morning that Michigan actually passed some HIV criminalization reform. It apparently got signed at the very end of December. So that's really exciting. I wish I had known sooner. I would have tried to publicize that a little bit more, but I just found out. So if there's anyone from Michigan here today, congratulations. If not, congratulations anyway to folks in Michigan. And I also saw that Missouri has filed legislation to modernize their HIV criminalization laws as well. So again, if there's anyone from Missouri, congrats on that. And hopefully it will move forward and everything will go smoothly. A quick housekeeping before we get started. So basically I'm trying to do as a webinar pretty much the same in-person training that we did at HIV Is Not a Crime, which was extremely interactive. It was really discussion based more than a presentation. And so thinking about how to do this as a webinar, I still want it to be discussion based because with something like media strategy, there's not just one single right answer, one formula. Different things are gonna work at different times, in different places. So I really like to have participants engaging in this and sharing their own experiences or their own ideas. And so I am gonna try to open it up at several points during this for folks to either ask questions or make comments, share your own experiences or ideas. And so to do that, there's a couple of different ways that can be done on this webinar. So one way is if you raise your hand. I don't have the attendee view, but I'm pretty sure that at the bottom of your screen, if you're on a computer anyway, there should be a little something you can click on that says raise hand. If you raise your hand, I can unmute you and you can talk. So that's one way. Or if you either don't want to talk or you don't see that or whatever, you can also put your question. There's a Q&A box. So again, in that little toolbar at the bottom of the screen, you should see something that says Q&A. You can put your question in there. If you have a question while I am talking. My suggestion would be to put it in the Q&A box, so that, because if you put it in the chat box and then other people start putting stuff in there, it might get lost and we may not see your question. So you can put your question in the Q&A box, and that way we can make sure to see it and address it when there's a good, stopping point. Otherwise, during a sort of like, if I open it up for questions and comments, if you want to put it in the chat box at that point, that should be fine, because we'll be actively, monitoring that and reading out folks' questions and comments at that point. So any of those ways is fine to participate. But I definitely want to hear from folks. So also another quick background thing, when we did this at HIV Is Not a Crime, it was both Kenyon Farrow and myself. And he's amazing, and he's a really excellent presenter and facilitator. And he was going to do this with me, and then unfortunately he's moving, and he wasn't going to have internet until tomorrow, and he was actually physically moving today, so that wasn't going to work. So that's why I'm doing it by myself, which is never my preference. So I definitely want there to be discussion, because I also don't really want to hear myself just talk for 90 minutes or even an hour or even less. So yeah, that's sort of the background to get started. And with that, I am going to share my screen. Yeah, give me one sec. There's PowerPoint. Okay, and now that I'm here, let me start the slideshow. Okay. Kamaria, what do you see right now?
I see your screen. I see on one side, on the left, it says media strategy, your title slide, and on the right-hand side, it shows what the next slide will be.
Okay, so how about, let me try something real quick. How about now?
I see just the title slide.
Yay, okay, it works, cool.
Awesome.
Okay, great. So like I said, this was originally done with Kenyon. I kept his name on here because he was part of creating this this presentation the first time, but unfortunately he's not here with us today. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to sort of bring, this is how I always start media strategy trainings, and this is a discussion point. So I'd like to open it up for folks to chime in already. My question that I always start with is, when do you want media in a campaign to change HIV criminalization laws? And because I'm sharing I can't. Okay, so I can't actually see anything.
I can see the chat, but no one's saying anything yet.
Come on. Okay, wait, hold on. Let me see if I can find a way to, okay. Okay, I was able to pull up the chat now. Let me see if I'm able to.
And I mean, I don't mind starting off the conversation.
Oh, great, thank you.
Folks, so Kamaria here in Florida. The question was, when do you want to go for media? Yeah, so I would say from my experience working with the coalition in Florida with our laws and kind of being really cautious about when we were going to say anything in the media. I know that the safest method is when we see misinformation and we want to kind of address transmission, like this conversation around how transmission actually occurs. Sometimes media puts out the wrong information. So using facts and science to correct that in an op-ed or something of that nature is the time where I think you should definitely go for the media.
I agree, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like Wanda wanted to say something. I have unmuted you, Wanda, so you can.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, this is Wanda Brittle Moss. I live in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. One of the things that I have learned from my much loved association with Positive Women's Network, with the Zero Project and other venues. Anyway, you have to you can't go to the media until you as a group have a concise and clear message, a unified message, because if we are divisive, we wind up hurting more than we help.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Lisa. Lisa, I've unmuted you, so you can talk. Or wait, it looks like, hold on, make sure you're unmuted. Where is my, okay, there's my cursor. Okay, so Lisa, you are unmuted on my end, so if you want to say something, you may need to unmute yourself on your end.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Wonderful. Hi, this is Lisa Johnson-Lett from Alabama. I wanted to chime in. I wanted to say also that as individuals and as a concise group, that we also need to understand First People language, and we also need to be educated before we go to any kind of media, because as Ms. Wanda said, we don't want to hurt or harm or hinder what we're trying to do. So I feel that we all need to be, those that are not, or that's new to media strategies, I think that we should all have a class and understand First People language.
Yeah.
Like transmission, you know, not spreading, but transmit, not the infected, you know, just use First People language. That's all.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's really, really important, the language that we use. So yeah, instead of saying HIV infected person, which is one of those things that grates on people's my nerves too, you know, a person living with HIV. Yeah, we have a whole chart of that on our website, and PWN is actually going very soon is going to be producing some palm cards with that language that you can carry with you, that you can hand out to folks, that you can give to reporters or to camera people if you're being interviewed, to kind of help, because a lot of people don't know, right? It's not necessarily people trying to be mean or stigmatizing, just a lot of people don't know better. So it's our duty to make sure that they do know better. Thank you for that. Okay, Wanda, you can still talk.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm glad you brought that up. We have had the advantage of being part of this movement for a while. So we have kind of grown with it. I'm ever grateful for that. But many persons that are living with HIV are not even aware of the terminology that present day HIV should be used. I ran into that recently. Somebody posted something and I replied to him, and it was about criminalization. And I replied to him and I told him that I was not trying to be offensive to him in any way, because you never want to do that. You always want to build bridges rather than build barriers. So we have education amongst ourselves on how to speak modern day language. So I just want to throw that out there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Great. Did anyone else have any ideas about when we do want to get media coverage in HIV criminalization efforts? So far we've heard for correcting inaccurate information that's being put out by the media, for sure. Also, we've heard when you have a unified message, and so everybody who's working on this issue is on the same page about what the message is, that's super important. Also, Lisa reminded us of the importance of using people first language and making sure that advocates who are going to be speaking to the media know that language and are able to use it. Also very important. I would just add to those points. At the end, when you win, for sure, you would want to celebrate that in the media. It can be a little bit tricky sometimes, which we're going to get into in this presentation. But I would say, so the things that folks have already said, also when you have designated spokespeople who are trained, who know the message, who know the talking points, who are trained in how to stay on message, just because it is such a sensitive and controversial topic that, and a lot of times, because it's something that's happening at the state level, in many cases, if there's coverage of it, it's going to be, for example, local newspapers or local TV news. And for the most part, these are not journalists who are super experienced with HIV. This is just one thing that's on their plate among many. So they probably don't have a lot of education and information about HIV itself, how, transmission, even about the laws. So you're going to have to, we need spokespeople who know how to educate reporters as well as the general public and who know their message. And so because you're talking to, like I said, to local news, who this is not something that they cover every day, you just need to be that much more versed, as opposed to, for example, if you're talking to HIV media, like you're talking to thebody.com or you're talking to Pause or Plus, those reporters know how to use appropriate language. They know about HIV, obviously. They know about the laws. So that's going to be a much easier interview than talking to your local TV news station, which is also usually looking sort of for something sensational. So those are just kind of some things to keep in mind. And then what about, when might you not want media in a campaign? Oh, okay. And I see Katie over here saying when our side isn't being heard, media can sometimes be one-sided. That is a good point. So if you, thank you for bringing that up. So if you saw a whole lot of, for example, if there was opposition to the bill and those people are putting out, op-eds or press releases and they're talking to the media about it and you feel like your side is not getting any airtime, that would definitely be a case where you would want to get into the media, where you would want to be able to respond. And the way that you would respond, I think, would depend on what was happening, in terms of what kind of media coverage was there. Like if somebody published an op-ed, then you might want to respond with an op-ed. If it's a lawmaker who's going on TV talking about this, you might need a more aggressive approach. So it would really depend on the situation. And then I see Teresa says, when will the cards for terminology be available and where? That's a really good question. I don't have an exact date for you yet. It's on my list of things to do this spring. My goal is to have those ready and printed by AIDS Watch to begin an initial distribution at that time, since I know there'll be a whole lot of HIV advocates there that we can, get them out to. That's my hope. It's not 100% guaranteed, but that's my goal. But once we have them printed, we can also send them to folks. So even if you're not going to be at AIDS Watch and you want some anyway, we can send them to you. So when we have those ready, we'll definitely be getting the word out to PWN members and probably a little bit wider than that as well. So stay tuned. I will let you know when they're ready. Cool. So those were about when we want media. So how about when we don't want media in a campaign, specifically around HIV criminalization laws? Wanda, you can talk.
Oh, okay, Jenny. We've not, to my knowledge, we've not done this with PWN or with Zero, but something, there was a message that we, as part of the Moral Monday Reverend Barber movement here in North Carolina, did, and it had a very profound effect. We always gather on the mall right across from our state legislator, but on this, and usually we're chanting and doing all this other stuff, but on this particular event, they had brought duct tape, and everyone duct taped their mouth, and to see, it was total silence. There were probably 1,000 people on the mall getting ready to go through, 500 anyway, to go into the legislative building, which we call the People's House. It's our house. And we march all the way through. We go up to the 3rd floor. We come down where they actually have, but it was very profound, the silence. Sometimes, just like the 60 song, Silence is Golden, sometimes that silence speaks volumes.
Right, but in that case, you were probably getting media coverage, right?
Yes.
See, so that was a tactic for the media, and you're right. It's definitely a very powerful image. It's a super powerful image. But in that case, the goal was actually to be covered by media and for that image to have power like that. So
Yeah.
it's a really
Yeah,
smart
that
tactic.
that went with credit. That was a good answer for question 1. I apologize.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, no, that's definitely a very cool tactic. But when would we want to just like avoid the media? We don't want them covering us. We don't want to talk to them. Teresa, if you wanted to say something, I have unmuted you, so you're welcome to talk. But you may need to unmute yourself if you were trying to say something. Okay. Cool. So no ideas about Kamaria, do you see anything in the chat box?
No, but I did have a thought, maybe. So I would think you don't want media when if you're doing something in your state, whether it's with a coalition or a network or with a legislator and a small group of folks, and you don't want to bring attention to the fact that you're about to file a bill or you're about to, I don't know, just make a move that will highlight the opposition to come after you, then you definitely don't want media to be aware of that or to bring attention to it, or to change your narrative. You want to, if you're trying to move strategically and maintain power over your narrative, you definitely don't want the media involved. Yeah, that's the thought that I had around that.
Great, thank you. And can I ask you just to elaborate a little, why would you not want media attention around like a bill that that a legislator was about to file?
I mean, so I don't remember what our bill number was in Florida when this was happening, but this didn't actually happen in Florida, but when we did introduce our bill in the Senate and the House, our bill sponsor asked us, for complete, like, just silence around it, prior to, like, leading up to the bill actually being filed. And part of that had to do with, personal relationships he possibly have leveraged in the Capitol, where that group of legislators may not have wanted the attention because they didn't want it to impact bills that they were working on. You have to keep in mind that there's a lot of like negotiation conversations going on when you have a bill sponsor. So sometimes if they're asking you to be quiet, it's not because they don't believe in your message, or it's not because they want control over it. It's because they are often bartering and bargaining to get support and votes for your bill as it moves through whatever channels it has to move through. And along that route, he or she is probably also making promises like, yeah, we'll keep this quiet until your bill goes through, or yes, we'll keep this quiet until XYZ. So that's just the first reason that pops in my head. There's a lot of other ones I just have to sit and think about them.
Yeah, and that's a really great point. So it may be that the legislators themselves want it to stay quiet, especially if you're in a state that tends to be pretty conservative. They, if they, like Kamaria said, if they're talking behind the scenes and trying to get other legislators, usually a lot of times from the other party, because if you're in, let's say that you're in a state that's dominated by Republicans and you have a Democrat sponsoring your bill, they're going to need Republicans to support it if it's going to pass. And so to get those Republicans on board, they're going to have these conversations one-on-one. And if there's a bunch of media coverage and it tends to, people all of a sudden are getting upset about it, or the message isn't resonating the way that you want it to, then that could really hurt efforts for them to find other people that they need to support the bill. So I'm glad that you brought that up. That's a really important point. Also, I think it's just important to know that as a general rule, even if you're in a very progressive state, even if you're in a state like California or New York, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be overwhelming public support for efforts to change these laws, especially just, out the gate. Because the general public tends to be not that educated about HIV. I would say most of the general public doesn't know that much about the realities of transmission, what does and does not actually constitute a risk, what those risks are, what it even means to be living with HIV today in terms of being able to have a normal life, being able to have a family, a normal sex life, etc. So, you know, if you, a story that comes out, people a lot of times, like I know what I usually do in the morning, I look at the headlines. And then I'll maybe choose 2 or 3 articles that I want to read, either because I feel like it's super important or it's something that I'm interested in. But most people tend to read headlines and maybe skim. And so, you know, that people's first opinion about something may not be the most informed one, even if they're people who tend to be progressive in general. So just putting out something as complicated as changing these laws without the proper education happening first can be a little bit dangerous for your efforts, is kind of what I would say. So you definitely want to be strategic about it. Other times when you wouldn't want media, if you don't have spokespeople who are ready to talk about this with media, if you don't have a unified message, you know, if you don't even have, let's say you don't even have a bill, you definitely don't necessarily want to be talking about that. But that's not to say that there are not other things that you can be talking about in the media that could be helpful to your efforts. You know, educating people about HIV is always a good idea. And so if you're working on a bill, you know, you have maybe you have a sponsor and that person is trying to get other co-sponsors and, you know, trying to get other legislators to support it. In that case, you may not want to go to the media and say, hey, we got this great bill. But what you might want to do is, you know, try to pitch some stories about HIV today, what that means, to help educate the public so that if and when it does come out, hopefully people have been hearing more positive messages and are, you know, have been educated a little bit more. And that can, and, you know, that's important also for the legislators because they also need that education. So there are ways that you can, or you even, you know, having some stuff about HIV criminalization laws in general without being very specific about what you're trying to do in that state. So those are just ideas. It's always a case-by-case basis, but those are a few times when you might want or not want media attention. And not all media is good media. I think it's really important to note that. When you work in communications and PR, you know, a lot of times there's this expectation that you need to get media coverage for everything, but that's actually not true. Sometimes getting media coverage can hurt what you're trying to accomplish. Sometimes you have a better chance of getting it done without media coverage, particularly in the beginning or during very sensitive junctures in the campaign. And I'm just going to give you a few examples of things that could hurt media, that can actually hurt your efforts. So these are real headlines. I think I pulled all of them. I put this together last year, and so they're all from within like the last, let's say, probably 3 or 4 years. So these are real headlines. HIV infected man who had sex with 42 women can be confined indefinitely. Is that going to help your efforts? Okay, so this was the actual article. So an HIV positive man who caused a mini epidemic in Chautauqua County after giving 13 women and girls the AIDS causing virus will remain confined indefinitely, an appeals court ruled this month. This is about Nushan. I know a lot of you probably are familiar with Nushan. So Nushan Williams, 39, used force and charm to have sex with 42 women and girls, some under the age of 14, in the 1990s after knowing he was HIV positive. He spent 12 years in prison for rape and reckless endangerment. Okay, so that's an example of a headline that can be damaging. Some other headlines that can damage our efforts. These are also, you know, again, real headlines. I'm sure everyone remembers Charlie Sheen. So this was a headline: Charlie Sheen, exposing sex partners to HIV is a crime. Man sentenced to life after infecting toddler niece with HIV, impregnating teen. Male porn star with HIV jailed for sexual contact with Limerick boy. Limerick is a city somewhere, not the one in Ireland. It was somewhere in the US. I can't remember what state. A report: man with HIV assaults hospital employees. HIV positive Pennsylvania man didn't tell 3 women about his condition, sentenced to 5 years in prison. So these are real headlines. And headlines like those, when you have these headlines about actual cases of where HIV criminalization laws are being enforced and applied, then those headlines are really damaging to your efforts, right? Because in a lot of cases, not in every case, but in a lot of cases, the ones that really make headlines are pretty egregious cases where actual crimes were committed, like rape or child molestation, things that, you know, nobody wants to be associated with. And unfortunately, when those headlines come out and then people hear, oh, well, they're trying to change those laws, and the gut reaction is, oh my God, no, don't change those laws. We need those laws, right? So they can be really damaging. So those types of headlines can lead to headlines like these. California governor to consider bill for reducing penalties for infecting others with HIV. California lawmakers passed legislation reducing HIV penalty for knowingly exposing sex partners to HIV. These headlines are, first of all, that's not really accurate about what the California law was doing, but these are laws these were headlines that came out. These were around the California efforts specifically. California lawmakers vote to reduce penalty for knowingly exposing sexual partners to HIV. What's wrong with these headlines, in your opinion? Feel free to put it in the chat box, the Q&A box, raise your hand if you want to talk. Wanda, did you want to talk?
Sure. They sensationalize and they take us back almost to the 1980s when everything was horrifying and, you know, people were scared, you know, you're going to get that and you're not going to live and you're going to die. And that's not where we are with HIV anymore. Mm-hmm. It's sensationalism, which enhances their readership or whatever, but it does nothing for persons living with HIV, and it truly does nothing for the person who feels like they are a victim, which, unless you are a victim of sexual assault or something like that, if we become HIV positive, it takes 2 people in a relationship, and we have enough education now about HIV, we can't blame anybody else. We are each responsible for our own sexual behaviors. Off my soapbox now.
Thanks, Wanda. And I see Lisa put in the Q&A box that the headlines are not HIV friendly. It stigmatizes the HIV community. I agree. These are for the most part stigmatizing headlines, and they also imply that this is. I have a problem with them on a few levels, and in some cases the articles themselves were not terrible, but the headlines were, and that's not so. And that's actually, I can talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But you know, like for example, this one that's on the screen right now. California lawmakers vote to reduce penalty for knowingly exposing sexual partners to HIV. Even if technically that's what the bill does, the way that it's phrased makes it sound like well, and first of all, that's not 100% accurate, but even if it were, it makes it sound like, A, this is something that happens often, frequently, that people living with HIV are purposely, you know, trying to have sex with people and transmit HIV, which we know is not true. And it kind of paints this negative, even without saying specific things, it still paints this sort of picture of people living with HIV as predators or as dishonest people, somehow people who are trying to harm others. And it doesn't really address a lot of the issues around the complexity of disclosure and why people don't disclose their status. So, you know, it's not necessarily that there were negative intentions in writing the articles or even the headlines, but a lot of times the impact can be negative anyway. I don't know if anyone, Little Easy E came out against the California bill saying that it would, of course, this is the son of the Eazy-E, saying changing the HIV law would be crazy. He gave this really terrible example of what about some woman who's going to sleep with an entire football team or an entire basketball team and give them all HIV or something like that. Really terrible quote. So that happened. And honestly, I would say having worked, I didn't work a lot on the communications on that bill. There was a coalition that was working on it, and there were some communications folks as part of that coalition. But I would say one of the problems that happened there in California, which I'm going to get into a little bit more later too, but one of the problems that happened there in California was that it was a freshman state senator who was the sponsor of the legislation, Scott Wiener, who was an openly gay man who also was open about taking PrEP. And he wanted media coverage of the bill because this was legislation that he was sponsoring. He was new. He was trying to sort of make a name for himself. And so he really insisted on putting out press releases and on trying to get media coverage. And, you know, it wasn't, in my opinion, the timing wasn't right for that. And I think that's part of what contributed to some of the more negative headlines and the more negative coverage. And so sometimes sometimes when you're working on legislation, you're put in that situation. If you have a lawmaker who really, really wants to get the word out about it to the media, you may not have much of a choice, because in this case, for example, his own communications office, his own PR team was putting out press releases. So, you know, sometimes you are also sort of at the mercy of the lawmakers who are sponsoring your legislation. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But that being said, not all of the media coverage in the California campaign was negative. There was actually some really great coverage that we got out of it, especially when, you know, we tried to take back control of the narrative, when we, you know, kind of got our talking points straight, had good spokespeople talking with the media. We got, for example, this was a good headline: while HIV is treatable, states keep laws criminalizing it from AIDS panic area. So this headline is already setting it up as showing that these laws are not needed, right? That they don't make sense. I really liked this headline. Proponents argue for HIV criminalization reform. Neutral, straight down the road. This was an LGBT newspaper in Oakland. And so this one doesn't set you up to make up your mind one way or the other, which is honestly like the best you can hope for. Well, you can hope for them to be on your side, but you can, you know, getting something neutral is good. Lawmakers aim to take California's HIV-specific crimes off the books. Okay, that one wasn't bad. It doesn't sort of predispose your mind to think that this is a bad thing. California senator moves to rewrite state's HIV transmission laws. Again, pretty neutral. New California bill would update HIV laws. Neutral. These were local news stations. So you can see, I mean, you know, they're not like, oh wow, what a great headline, but they're not bad. And these are, you know, again, like this is ABC 10, this is a local news station. So when you can get local news that tends to sensationalize things to give you neutral coverage, that's a win for sure. Okay, this state might get rid of laws that make having sex with HIV a crime. That was a good one. California lawmakers are considering a new bill that would roll back state laws which criminalize the transmission of HIV. Laws critics say are a relic from a time when fear outweighed knowledge of the virus. And so for this one, I actually am going to show this video segment because I think it's worth watching. It's short. This was good coverage, and the reason I like to show this in the training is because it shows what having a good message and good spokespeople can do for your bill. So I actually have to stop sharing my screen for a second to share a different screen. So give me one sec.
Jenny, can I say something while you're doing that?
Absolutely.
And this goes back to the congressperson's people having the media message or driving the media message, it hit me, we've got AIDS Watch coming up, and that's the importance of us being at AIDS Watch, because then we get to go to the offices of our representatives with our agenda, with what our message, we feel our message should be, and can have interaction with their staff. And who knows, we may help them understand that what they're saying is harming more than it's doing good. That's why it's so important for we the people living with HIV be at AIDS Watch, whatever it takes to get there. Off my soapbox.
Thank you, Wanda. Yeah, I agree. And also, it's also important to know that AIDS Watch is, while it's a great opportunity to talk to your members of Congress, it's not the only one. So you can always, your members of Congress have an office, and well, senators have different offices throughout the state. Congress people, your representatives in the House of Representatives, they will have a local office. And so you can, when they're going to be in town, when Congress is in recess, you can schedule a visit to go see them. You can always make phone calls. So AIDS Watch is a great opportunity, but don't feel like if you can't go to AIDS Watch, then you don't have any other opportunities, because you definitely do. But when we're talking specifically about state criminalization laws, the most important people are actually going to be your state representatives and so your state senators and your state representatives, because these laws are at the state level. So even if you have the support of your members of Congress, they cannot really do much by themselves. They might be able to talk to people, but they don't have the power to vote for or against a bill that you have. So for those, for state laws and policies, you really want to focus on your state legislators. I see something in the... okay, great. You answered that. Great. Okay, so I have my, you know what though? I think, hold on. Sorry, just a second. I think I need to make sure I have the sound shared as well. I'm going to try this again. Share computer sound. Now let's try it. Okay, and I had to mute this a little while ago because it had an annoying ad that was just making noise and playing music I didn't want to hear. So let's try. I'm muting it. Come on. Hopefully it's unmuted now. Let's see. Oh, no, it's still muted. Sorry, hold on. It's these stupid ads. If it weren't for the ads, I wouldn't have to do this. Unmute site. There we go. Okay. Shut up. Sorry, guys. Oh. Okay, now let's see if we can listen to it. Sorry about that.
As a form of discrimination.
Disclosure.
There we go. Bear with me.
3-year-old law on HIV disclosure. Right now, it is a felony if someone does not disclose their HIV status to a sexual partner.
But some say that law is a form of discrimination. CBS 13's Macy Jenkins spoke with a senator who says Californians are at risk without it.
I was young. Of course I was terrified, for sure.
Alejandro Contreras recalls the fear he felt 9 years ago, hearing the words, "You're HIV positive."
I'm 21. This is over. Like, what am I doing? Like, I actually lost friends.
And he's not alone. Back in the 1980s and 1990s, the fear of HIV and AIDS spread quickly, prompting California to create laws making it a felony to knowingly expose someone to HIV.
When these laws were enacted, there was no effective treatment for HIV. It was, for many people, a death sentence.
But Senator Scott Wiener says it's a new era with new medication, making the likelihood of infecting another person with HIV very low.
You don't reduce HIV infections by classifying people as felons. you reduce HIV infections by giving people access to health care and information.
Senator Wiener says knowingly exposing someone to other infectious diseases is classified as a misdemeanor, and HIV should be no different. But not everyone has the same perspective.
This is a serious attack. We're not talking about somebody who transfers it in an innocent way. We're talking about somebody who does it to harm you.
Senator Joel Anderson says the felony rule should stand because transmitting HIV could affect someone for the rest of their life.
And I think that that person, that victim, deserves better from us.
Since his diagnosis, Contreras says he's learned and educated people on how a person with HIV can live a happy and healthy life.
I feel like in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of research and a lot of destigmatization, but it still exists.
Now he says the state is on the right track to encourage more people to get tested for HIV and seek treatment.
I always know that California, whatever we decide, the rest of the country follows.
Today, the bill moved one step further in the Public Safety Committee.
Senator Wiener says in the long run, discriminating HIV is a positive step for public safety. He believes it'll take the fear and shame out of asking for help when, of course, you need it.
Okay, putting that down, stopping the share, and going back to sharing the other screen. So, I mean, I'm sure that folks can find plenty of things in that news segment to criticize. I can as well around some of the language that's used. But that aside, I would say that that was actually an example of good media coverage of an effort. There's always probably going to be something that you can find to say they shouldn't have said this, they shouldn't have said that. But overall, I would say that was positive. Of course, they did interview somebody on the other side, but they're always going to do that. So just know that, especially if you're talking about a very mainstream news outlet, like a local news station, which this was, when they're looking for someone who's in favor, they're going to also find somebody who's against it. That's just the way media outlets work. So you can't be upset that they interview somebody who is against your bill. That's going to happen. The important thing is that it's framed in the way that you as advocates want it framed. In this case, it was about being discrimination. It was also educating about the realities of living with HIV today. And so for that, it was actually good coverage. Cool, and let me check there we go, okay. Okay, and this was another article that came out still about the California bill. Keeping HIV positive status from a partner is a felony. A bill would change that. I was not crazy about this headline, but the article itself was actually excellent. And so sometimes the headlines are not as good as what's written or what's covered. And so just to share a few sort of rules of the road and some of the lessons that we learned in the California effort. Okay, not all media is good media. I already said that. It can be very damaging, and that can also be helpful. So it's important to know the difference and to think strategically. And you may not, you're not going to get it right all the time, every time, but the idea is that you want to limit the damage as much as possible, and when media will help to use it strategically at those moments. During legislative hearing process, such as committees, when a bill, for folks who are familiar with the way legislation works, who are not familiar with it, first the sponsor is going to write a bill, he's going to seek co-sponsors for it, they're going to introduce it, he'll continue to seek co-sponsors, and then it's going to go through different committees based on what the bill itself is and does. And then usually, Kamari, do you know how many committees a bill typically has to get through before it goes to the full?
So the rule of thumb here in Florida is that if it gets assigned to more than 3 committees, that's not a good sign. Usually 3 or less is good. So for example, right now, we only have a bill in the House and it's assigned to 4 committees. So it's like a kind of a good thing, but it's only in the House. So it's not really a good thing. So I think it depends on your state, but 3 or less is pretty much a quick process.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's that then, okay, because I wasn't actually sure as if there was like a set number of committees that the bills typically had to go through. So I guess it depends. But yeah, while it's going through those committees, however many it is, you really probably don't want media attention around it, because if any of that media attention is negative, and let's say it's a local news station in a small town and there was a legislator that was thinking about getting on board with this and it's causing an uproar and people are upset about it, he's probably going to back down now, and now you've just hurt your chances of that bill getting passed. So keeping it quiet and letting the legislative sponsor, your legislative champion, do that work for you rather than the media, that's really crucial. You may not be able to help it, it may get out anyway, but you definitely don't want to, I would say you don't want to be proactive about trying to get media attention while it's moving, quietly through committees. Quiet is usually better. However, that being said, it does not mean that you should not have a message, talking points, and spokespeople ready if the media does pay attention, because it could still get out. There are reporters who cover what's happening in the legislature. You also, there could be opposition and somebody decides they want to make their name by denouncing this bill. So it can get out there. And if it does, you want to be ready to address it. And that means that by the time you have a bill, you should pretty much know your message. Hopefully you have some talking points, even if they're pretty general ones. And you should have spokespeople that you trust who can talk to the media if it's necessary. And then some do's and don'ts about public messaging. Everyone's different cases are different, but I would say these are these are kind of my general standards when we're talking specifically about HIV criminalization. Do use public health messaging. So things like how effective treatment is today, statistics about transmission are really important. Incentives to testing and treatment. If you can make the case that these laws are not in favor of public health and work against public health, that's a good argument, okay? Because everybody wants good public health. So I think that's one of the strongest arguments in favor of getting rid of the laws, that having these criminalization laws has done nothing to actually reduce transmission. In fact, the states that tend to have and enforce the laws the most, which tend to be the South, are also states that have the highest rates of new cases of HIV. And I think it's pretty easy to make the connection in a lot of cases that the unequal access to healthcare in those places is what's actually driving the epidemic, along with stigma. The laws in those places are not preventing the epidemic or ending the epidemic. So I think those are strong arguments. It is a really, really great idea to have public health officials, medical providers or HIV researchers, or if possible, even law enforcement officers or prosecutors who are willing to speak or write in support of your bill. So even before, even if you don't want to go to the media at this point, if you have a bill or you're working on getting a bill, it's a really good idea to start reaching out to public health officials, doctors, HIV researchers, even in some cases law enforcement. If you can get them on your side early on, it's going to make it a lot easier once there is a need or desire for media, because let's say an HIV doctor or a public health official writing an op-ed or having their name on an op-ed supporting changing the laws, that carries a lot more weight with a lot of people than just you or me or an advocate or a PR person. So having somebody who has that sort of credibility, I think that's really, really helpful. And we did have some of that in California, and we needed it. So lining it up early instead of scrambling at the last minute trying to find somebody who's willing to say something publicly or put their name on an op-ed, I think that's a really important thing. Do point out ridiculous parts of the existing laws. So if you live in a state where things like spitting or biting are covered under the laws, or where it makes absolutely no difference if condoms were used, or if it was oral sex, or other activities that have zero risk of transmission, it's fair game to point those out, because it's they're really easy to say like, this is stupid. Because today I would say, even though people in general are not super educated about HIV, most people today do understand that something like spitting is not going to transmit HIV. Most people have at least that level of education. I'm not saying everybody, but I would say most people do. So it's going to make it easier to make the case that way. Do point out cases where that were prosecuted, for example, where HIV was not transmitted, and especially if transmission was impossible, either because the person had an undetectable viral load, or they used condoms, or it was oral sex and not actual, intercourse. Those are cases worth pointing to, because you're showing that somebody is being prosecuted for something that pretty much everyone would agree is a victimless crime, right? Crime in quotation marks. And do offer public health oriented solutions. I can't stress this enough. So you really want to, what you don't want to be doing is making a case that HIV doesn't matter, that it's no big deal, that, that we don't care if, people continue to acquire HIV. That's not going to be a winning argument. And so it's always good to have another solution. So if we're saying that these laws are bad and they're not the answer, then what is the answer, right? What is going to end the epidemic? What is going to prevent transmission? And that's a great opportunity to pull out the U=U and say, well, we know that you cannot transmit HIV if you have an undetectable viral load, and therefore we need to make sure that A, people are tested, and B, that they have access to care, so that they will have, besides having obviously better health outcomes for themselves, it will also prevent transmission. And as in states, for example, that have not expanded Medicaid, this is a great, way to bring up, we need to expand Medicaid. We need to have universal health care. Like, there's a lot of different ways that you can bring that in, but it's a great opportunity to advocate for solutions that are like real public health solutions. Or, to advocate for services to help people get engaged in care or to stay in care. So I think it's really important to offer solutions, not just say like, okay, these laws don't work, but what will work? But what do we know does work? And I think I saw there was Katie asked if we, can we have these slides sent to us later? Absolutely, I can actually share the entire slide deck with you all. We can send a follow-up email with that. Okay, so public messaging do's and don'ts, still on here. For the don'ts, don't bring, and this is not just about HIV criminalization, this is a general thing. Do not bring up the opposition's arguments for them. Don't do it. Even if you're saying this is not true, you're still repeating what they said, and that is what will stick in people's minds. It's like, I don't know if you all have heard of George Lakoff, but he's sort of a communications expert, and he wrote this really influential book that's really good for people who are interested in messaging and framing. It's a really great book to read. It's super short, and it's called Don't Think of an Elephant. When you hear that, don't think of an elephant, what's the first thing you think of? An elephant, right? So don't say the opposition's arguments for them. And one example of where this happened in the California case, we had a press call where we invited reporters to come on this call. Senator Weiner was on there talking about the bill. Bless his heart, as we say in the South. A reporter asked a question that I think was not framed in a good way. Instead of sticking to his talking points, he decided to address the question, and he starts talking about, there's this myth of the AIDS monsters. And he starts going on about how this is a myth, it's not true. And I'm like, you just said it though. You just said AIDS monsters. Like, don't say things that you don't want other people saying or thinking. It was a really bad move. So make sure that you're sticking with your talking points, that you have a positive message, it's a public health centered message, it's a human rights message, you're offering solutions, and you're not repeating the talking points of the opposition. Sarah, I see you are raising your hand. 1 second, and I will.
And Jenny, I have a question after Sarah.
Oh, okay, cool. Why don't you go ahead and ask while I unmute these other folks?
In that situation where Weiner was going off on a tangent about the AIDS monster,
Mm-hmm.
and the coalition comes back to the table to have a conversation about, you know, pros and cons of how that piece went. How do you recalibrate? How do you address, especially when it's your bill sponsor, how do you approach that conversation without making them feel like they totally trashed your whole campaign? But how do you fix it?
That's a good question. And like I said, I wasn't super heavily involved with the PR on that campaign, so I'm not sure exactly how the folks who were doing most of the heavy lifting on the comms, the communications on that campaign, what they did. If it were me, if I were actually, you know, working with the lawmaker, I would definitely sit down and have a talk and you know, give them some, because you know they know a lot of things, but they're not always experts in everything, and everyone can always use, you know, including me, we can all use some extra like training and reminders and practice. So fair, you don't have to like yell and scream at them, but you can definitely have a conversation about why what they said was not helpful and why it would be a good idea not to do that type of thing again. And then in terms of like responding to bad media, I don't actually remember what, if anything, came of that quote. I was on, I think I remember I was on that press call when he said it. And I was, but I don't remember if the quote actually came out anywhere or not. But there was some negative press coverage, like I showed you all earlier. And like how to respond to that. It was really a conversation each time. Like, first of all, like how big is this and how wide is it going to go? Because there can be a negative article that comes out, but if it's just one and it's say like one local newspaper, you're probably better off just ignoring it and hoping that it goes away and that people forget about it. If it's something where all of a sudden a lot of different media outlets are picking it up and talking about it, that's when you are going to probably want to respond. So if it's just one thing or a couple of things and you don't feel like they're really getting, you know, have that bigger reach, then you can probably just, you know, cross your fingers that it's going to die down. You don't necessarily want to respond to everything, because then you're just kind of keeping it in the media when otherwise it might have gone away. Okay, and so I have Sarah. Did you want to ask a question or?
Yes. Yes, I wanted to make a comment. We did, when you were speaking of the laws, we did manage to have the spitting and biting took out of the law in Louisiana last year.
That's great. I mean, that's a start.
That is a start, a great start, really, because it had been in there for so long, ever since they created the law. So we did manage to have that part taken out, but we still have work to do.
Absolutely. I mean, I personally, there's different opinions, of course, and I'm sure if you were at HIV Is Not a Crime, you probably heard a lot of those different opinions in terms of like what's good or bad when you're making these changes in laws. Personally, I think any progress is better than no progress, which is not, you know, I don't think we should let the perfect be the enemy of the good, but you know, people have different opinions, but I think that that's positive, because you could always use that to build on and say, well, you know, these parts were taken out because they're not aligned with science, and so why are these other parts still there when they are also not aligned with science?
Exactly.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
And I think Tana and Lisa also wanted to talk, I believe.
Hoping Jeffrey will be here talking. Oh, Jennie, I'm sorry. I was just listening. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
No worries.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, so I just wanted to make a comment also. I also believe that public messaging also goes beyond just the media also. So like I train within the community, and once a month I help facilitate and co-host lunch and learns within the community.
I'm going to get back here.
At the different areas. And so another thing that we want to do is, I just wanted to make a statement that we need to, like if I'm co-facilitating with somebody, I need to know the points that we're going to be talking about and seeing exactly what kind of messaging we're going to deliver when we host the lunch and learns. And like when we were saying about utilizing first people language and utilize the modern language, because HIV is always changing the language You know, instead of using AIDS, use advanced HIV, just different things like that. But there was a statement that was used, and you could have hit me upside my face, and I had to try and remain my composure in front of everybody. And they started talking about HIV and AIDS related to the tick, tick, boom. I'm like, the tick, tick, boom? What? So I just want to make that statement. Like, we just have to know not only who our audience is, but know who we're co-facilitating with. That's all.
I 100% agree with you on that. Public messaging is absolutely not just for media. Your public messaging is important, whether you're talking to media, whether you're going into a meeting or an event where you want to talk to, where you're hoping to like get the public to support or the community to support what you're doing. You always want to, like, you want to be on message all the time, not just when you're on camera. So that's.
And I'm sorry. And one more other thing is, like, even with the agency that I work at, one day I hope I get the opportunity to teach First People language, because I don't know if it's trauma related, or like a trigger, but I don't care who it is. When they start off a sentence, yeah, you know, so and so, that was full blown. But where does full blown? What is the derivative of full blown? It's derivative of full blown is talking about people with AIDS back in the 80s. Why you even want to start a conversation like that, especially in an AIDS servicing organization?
Yep.
That's all.
Agreed. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of work to be done even within the HIV community for sure. And that's why it's important as advocates that you know your language, you know your talking points, whether it's about criminalization or other policies, because if you don't have that straight when you're talking to people who want to be on board with you, then how is anyone else going to have it straight? That's something that we're responsible for. Let's see.
Hey guys, this is Wanda, and Lisa, thank you for bringing that up. And I am one of the troublemakers that there's always one. Anyway, and Barb Cardell has helped me to work out something that is acceptable to the persons that would prefer to utilize advanced HIV, because I identify as I'm HIV positive, living relatively healthily with AIDS, because I was given that diagnosis. And many persons has ever gone through this little journey, you know, that the little path we go down. Many persons, when we try to take away that word AIDS, they are highly offended. They survived it. It is part of our history. So when you come in contact with persons like myself, it is no negativity intended for those that choose to use that slightly different language. It's just, as a registered nurse, retired, as someone who was diagnosed with AIDS in 2008, I can't negate that part of my history. And like I said, it's no offense to anyone, but just so that you know, there are persons like myself out there who may not be as polite about saying it as I am right now in this forum, off my soapbox.
Thanks. Yeah, and I mean, we could spend a lot of time on that conversation, because there's definitely opinions on both sides of that, and I've heard both sides of it many times, and I believe both sides have merit. I don't personally take a side on that argument. I leave that for the folks who are actually living with or affected by, to make that determination for themselves, how they want to identify themselves. So yeah, but you know, it might be something you want to address with your coalition. It is important. I think I would say the most important part of it is just to at least differentiate between HIV and AIDS. Anyone who is living with AIDS is also living with HIV, but not everyone who's living with HIV is living with AIDS, and they are two different diagnoses. So I do want to move on though, because we have limited time. Just keeping on with the don'ts. So don't get in the weeds, so to speak, on the details of the existing law and or the bill. When I say getting in the weeds, that means getting into the minute details. So exactly what the current law says and exactly what the bill would do. And there's a couple of good reasons that you don't want to go too much into obviously with legislators, you're going to go into details. But when you're talking to the media or usually the general public, you don't want to usually do that. And there's a couple of reasons. One is because a lot of times when you go into those details and you make people think about the different acts that are described in them, a lot of times that's going to end up working against you, because people are going to kind of go to that place where, oh, but if I was doing this with someone and they were living with HIV, I would want to know. And you're kind of giving them space to get into that zone. So that's one thing. And then also it just, when you do that, then you're kind of opening up a conversation that can, first of all, also the bill language is changing all the time. As your bill moves through committees and as your bill sponsor talks to other people to get their support, there are going to be changes. So if you're giving details about it today, those details might be inaccurate tomorrow. So if you get too much into the details of them, you're probably going to end up saying the wrong thing, because it may not be true anymore. And it certainly may not be true of the final bill. So that's also another reason not to. But it also means that you're going off message, because your message is always going to be, your talking points are going to be the top line talking points. The big messages we talked about: public health, human rights. The answer to the epidemic is increasing access to healthcare, it's education, it's not criminal law. And that's where you want to stay. You want to stay up here talking about those things. You don't want to get into, well, in section 5, I don't know how they're numbered, but it says here that if you do this and that, don't get that far into it. You want to just keep coming back to the big message, because that's the winning message. You don't want to say or imply that people have no responsibility for their partner's sexual health. Even if it's true that, yes, we are all responsible for our own sexual health, I would argue that the majority of the general public, if they're sleeping with somebody and that person has HIV or another STI, they probably want that person to tell them. And therefore, it's not really a winning public argument. I would say that's not a strong argument, and I would avoid it. That's me saying that. I know people who think it's a great argument, but I personally don't think that's going to win over a lot of people who are not already on your side. And then I would say don't use cases as poster cases or poster children, as we say, where people did acquire HIV or where there were violent crimes that were committed, such as sexual assault or anything involving children, anything that was not consensual. You want to stay away from those cases when you're trying to talk to media or even the general public about what you're doing. Those cases are going to hurt you. They are not going to help you. It doesn't mean that those individuals need to be prosecuted under HIV specific laws, don't get me wrong, but that's not part of your public message. You want to stay as far away from those as you can. They're just not going to help your efforts. And so then here I talk a little bit about op-eds and letters to the editor. So for anyone who's not familiar with the term op-ed, it's an opinion piece. It means opposite the editorial, as in like in old school newspapers, if you've seen one of those in a while. I haven't seen one in a while, but when you open it like this, and you'll have the editorial on one side, which is published by the newspaper. That's the editorial board's opinion. And then on the opposite page, there will be opinions from other people. So they could be readers, they could be experts, public officials, whatever. So those are opinions that are not written by people who work for the newspaper. So that's an op-ed. And the difference between an op-ed and a letter to the editor is a letter to the editor is really short. You're responding specifically to something that the newspaper published. An op-ed is longer. It's generally between about 600 to 800 words, typically around 600 to 700 words. And it's usually also touching on something that newspaper has already covered or something that's in the news in general. And yeah, so those are, and I would say an op-ed is going to have more reach than a letter to the editor, but a letter to the editor is easier to write and easier to get published. And so the role for those, I would say a response to bad press. And one of the reasons is A, it's a way to respond, period. And then B, you can really frame your response. You can say exactly what you want to say and not get caught up, you know, as you might in an interview with questions that you don't know how to answer, or you know, so it's a way to control the message and still get the message out there. It can be used for a push at an important moment. So if it's coming up for a vote, you know, and you're trying to get some support on it, having, for example, a public health official write an op-ed or put their name on an op-ed in the town where a legislator who's on the fence lives, that could help push that person over, you know, to vote for the bill. I already mentioned tightly controlled message. Authored by people with credibility in public health or medicine, that's ideal. Again, that person there is going to have more credibility with your average newspaper reader than somebody who is just a person living with HIV or an HIV advocate or a public relations person or whatever. That may not be fair, but that's the way it is. People are more likely to give weight to something that a scientist or a doctor or a public health official or a law enforcement official says about this issue than somebody who's not any of those things. You can draft a template ahead of time and line up authors and reserve until you need it. I already mentioned that. Just having those people on board is good. And then focus on education around actual risk and offer public health solutions. Again, instead of getting into the details of the actual bill or the existing law, you just want to have the top line message that these laws are not effective at, you know, they're not effective public health strategies. This is an effective public health strategy, access to healthcare, education, etc. So you want to offer solutions and you want to, you know, stick to your talking points. And then this was, I had this up as an example. We had an op-ed that was run in the East Bay Times. California's HIV laws are in the dark ages. And I'm trying to remember who wrote this. I would be able to look it up. But it was, I can't remember. I think it was, I want to say it was a public health official. I could be wrong. It was definitely somebody who had some kind of credibility in one of those areas. It wasn't law enforcement, so it was either a doctor or a public health official. And we had that person already sort of lined up and ready to go, and we had a sort of, you know, template or draft ready. And so when it was felt like it was needed, we were able to get that person to go ahead and, you know, put their spin on it, edit it, and send it in. So, and then finally, this was the last slide I have on here, just to let you know that this exists. If this is something that you're interested in or that you're actively working on or think you'll be working on in the future, this is a media toolkit that PWN and the HIV Justice Worldwide network put together. I think we released it last year. All the days and months and years run together for me at this point, but I'm pretty sure it was last year, last spring. It's called Making Media Work for HIV Justice. And this is actually sort of a worldwide one. It's not specifically about US media, but the rules are pretty much the same. This resource is available on PWN's website. And I put the short link up there on the slide. So if you're interested, please feel free to go look at that. And so there's just a few minutes left, and I want to open it up for questions, comments, ideas. And I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen so that I can see what's happening better.
Before folks start chiming in, Jenny, I just wanted to say awesome webinar. Always bringing forth information. Like every time I hear you talk about media, I remember something I forgot, or I learned something new. So thank you for taking part in the series for After HINAC, and hopefully this will motivate folks to, you know, continue to build relationships with their media people. That was actually a question I wanted to ask you. I forgot what slide you had up, but I guess my question is, how beneficial is it to develop or leverage and utilize personal relationships you may have with folks in the media?
Oh my God, if you know folks in the media or if you've met them, I think it's really important to have, or I mean, not to have, because relationships can always be built. But once you're in contact with a reporter, like try to, you know, make sure you have their contact info. Follow up with an email, maybe send them some more resources, thank them for the interview. It's really good to have relationships where you feel like if something happens, like, oh, well, this reporter wrote a really great article, and you know, if I write her, maybe she will answer me, or if I give her a call, right? I think it's not necessary to already have the relationships, but if you do have them, like, don't lose them. keep those people around, and offer education. Reporters need education too. One of the things I usually do when I talk with a reporter who's not, an HIV, like somebody who reports on HIV regularly, I try to assess like what they really know about HIV and transmission, and then I send them an email with links to different resources, and I send them a link to our preferred language chart. I send them, information about U equals U. Give them that education. They'll thank you for it. Like they're people. They want to learn too. And when people know better, they do better. So don't be afraid of educating reporters, because you need them to be educated.
Definitely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Are there other questions or comments? Okay, well, hearing none, I want to thank everybody for being on here. Sorry that you had to listen to me talk for so long. I was really looking forward to having Kenyon on here with me, but it's okay. He had important things to do, like move houses. So I really appreciate you all being here. And I do have every intention of sending a follow-up email with a link to the slides, and maybe some other links that might be helpful for you. And you should all feel free to contact me anytime. If you're working on media around your campaign, or you just have questions, please feel free to contact me. That's what I'm here for. I'm happy to answer your questions and offer even more assistance if I have the capacity and the know-how to do so. And this was recorded, so we will also have the recording available. Kamaria, do you know if there's like somewhere on the CIRO website where these are being made available?
I'm actually looking for that now. I don't have a link specifically, but by the time by the time the webinar recording link, that was a tongue twister for me, is available, I should have a link to where the past series webinars have been listed, as well as any future ones that are coming up. I know there's some more coming up because I'm supposed to do one. I just don't know when.
Yeah, cool. Okay, well, so CIRO, I'm sure we'll have them on their website, and then we'll put this one up on PWN's website as well. So the recordings will be available. So if you want to watch it again or share it with a friend or whatever, you will be able to do that. So thank you all so much for being here, and I hope to see or to speak with some of you soon. Oh, and if you live in Florida and you're helping with the bill here, with the effort here, and you want to be part of the media and communications work group, please hit me up.
Yeah, we have a call coming up on February 7th. I'll put my email in the chat. You can email me if you want me to add you if you're in Florida. I don't know if this will be available for the recording, so I'll say it as well. But my email is Kamaria, KAMARIA.Lafferty @CIROproject.com. And I can send you the invite to the group and the working groups. And you can work with Jennie because she's amazing. Yeah.
Not amazing, but I need help. So I need folks to join. So if you're in Florida, yes, please do. And hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and stay warm if you're somewhere that it's cold. Bye.